Now, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have signed an agreement to accelerate the implementation of a common strategy for the cocoa sector. The two countries hope the deal, titled the Abidjan Declaration, will help harmonise cocoa marketing policies and boost production. Edward George, the head of research at Ecobank, joins us on Skype from London to discuss the impact this deal could have. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Edward. Edward, do you have any idea what the strategic partnership really entails? Talking about the Abidjan Declaration, can you give us an insight into what's in that document?
Question.
Edward, I'm going to take that again. Can you give us an insight into what that strategic partnership agreement really entails? What's in that document, referring to the Abidjan Declaration?
Oh, sorry. And when was the Abidjan Declaration? Because there have been quite a few. Do you mean the one recently, or
the recent one? Yes, between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire.
Fine, sure, certainly.
So, give us an insight. Do you have any idea what's in that particular document? What are the agreements about? Talk us through this.
Well, I think the Abidjan Declaration is the natural next step for cooperation between Ivory Coast and Ghana. The two countries between them produce around 60% of the world's cocoa. It makes sense that there should be cooperation and collaboration between the two of them in the best interest of the cocoa sector. So I think with this latest declaration, we're trying to see both governments take a positive step forward. And what that means is to try and coordinate their policies on pricing so they don't create a differential in prices between the two countries that encourages smuggling. But I think also they want to move forward on this idea of building up strategic stocks in Africa, which can then be used to help stabilize prices internationally.
Now, Edward, many would argue, this is long overdue to begin with. What do you think triggered this new move? Why do you think both governments are this interested at this time? What happened?
Well, what we've seen is, certainly we've seen a rise in cocoa prices. First of all, we saw a slump over the last 2 years. Then in the last 6 to 8 weeks, we've seen a real surge in cocoa prices, which are now back up towards the top of the range of where they've been for the last 4 or 5 years. And that's because there is some concern about the light or the mid-crop coming up in both Ivory Coast and Ghana. And there's concern that earlier this year might have affected output. But I think generally this is part of a process. We saw both governments last year saying that they would collaborate closely. It takes some time to coordinate between both governments, and I think we're going to start seeing some concrete steps towards improving cooperation between the two countries' cocoa sectors.
Now, I don't have a copy of the document to begin with, but I understand this is actually some kind of common strategy to achieve a sustainable solution for the improvement of prices of cocoa, like you've mentioned. But what I find most interesting is the fact that they are now calling on the private sector to participate in cocoa processing, as against, of course, what has characterized the sector over the years, which is the export of raw cocoa seeds. How do you see this playing out? Are there policies on ground that would actually encourage the private sector to step in here? Or do we have, of course, that monopoly by government which has actually riddled the sector over the decades?
Well, I think the reality is the private sector is already heavily involved in grinding. Cote d'Ivoire is arguably the largest single grinder in the world. They grind more cocoa than even the Netherlands. And Ghana has a very large sector too. The real issue here comes down to subsidy. Every single processing sector in every single country in the world gets some kind of subsidy. It might be money from the government directly. It might be a tax break. It might be blockages on other competitors allowed to come to the market for a certain time. So the real question in both Ivory Coast and Ghana is what is the subsidy that the government's going to offer? Is it going to be a tax break? Is it going to be a discount on certain kinds of beans? That model has to be correct, because the reality is that any cocoa product produced in Ivory Coast or in Ghana has to compete internationally. It has to be competitive with products produced in North America or in Southeast Asia. So, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are part of the international cocoa market, and they need to set up a structure in their countries to make sense for the private sector to grind their cocoa there and not close to where it's actually being consumed, which is in North America and Western Europe.
Do we have that kind of infrastructure in place at the moment, or do you think this might take a while to set up?
Well, it's going to be very complicated to come up with the right structure. If you look at the structure in Cote d'Ivoire, the structure there was very much about certain tax breaks for grinders and also maybe a reduction in the cost of exported cocoa products rather than raw cocoa beans. In Ghana, most of the subsidy is in the light crop and a discount for the beans which come in, which are slightly smaller. But there are different ways of doing it. Ultimately, it would be very good for both countries to coordinate together so that their two grinding sectors are not actually competing, but complementing each other in the products that they produce for the world market.
Now, the international market might have their own standards, whether they're going to accept the processed cocoa seeds from these countries or not. But let's take a look at consumption regionally and locally. Now, I hear there are... Do you want me to take that question again?
Someone was talking over your question now. I couldn't hear it.
Oh. Well, I'm just going to take that one more time. Now, of course, the international market might have their own standards on the kind of processed beans they want to collect, and if it's up to par or not. But let's focus on consumption of, cocoa or, cocoa products here in Africa, regionally especially. Now, I hear there are locally produced chocolates in Ghana, for instance, and we don't find any of those here in the neighboring country like Nigeria. How do you think both countries can deal with encouraging local consumption of cocoa produce?
Well, I think the key to consumption of cocoa in Africa is that it's not about chocolate. You are right, they produce chocolate in Ghana, they do produce some in Nigeria and also in Cote d'Ivoire as well. But the reality is chocolate is not really part of the African palate, and certainly not the way that Western Europeans and North Americans eat it, which is milk chocolate. Milk chocolate basically melts in tropical climates. But there are many things that you can make from cocoa that are not chocolate. So we might be talking about soups, or cakes, or biscuits, or soft drinks. There are probably a dozen recipes that already exist in West Africa. Someone's grandmother made something with cocoa beans, which are delicious, and which fit the cultural eating habits, and which work for Africans. So the key here is to develop African consumption of cocoa in the kind of products that Africans like, and that ultimately is what will give power to the cocoa market. If you're basically producing all of your cocoa in order to export it for other people to consume, you're not going to have that kind of control, that power over the market. But if you look at someone like Ethiopia, they consume over half of the coffee that they produce. And that's why Ethiopian coffee is so expensive to import, because they're not giving it all away. It would be good if we could reach a similar level in West Africa, where there is West African consumption of cocoa in a way that fits West African diets and cultural habits.
Now, Edward, just in a nutshell, declaration signed, what is your biggest concern, really?
Well, I think there's a huge concern generally about getting financing to the right side of the chain. Working in Ecobank, this is one of our main concerns. How do you get financing to the farmers, to the cooperatives? There is a lot of risk in the sector. That's the risk associated with disease, with weather, with farmer performance. If you are a financial institution, you put money into the sector, there's a huge risk of losing. So we need to come better structures in order to get the financing to the end of the chain. And I think it really is supplying. It really is linking the value chain together, understanding that farmers and suppliers have a certain financing cycle, and then off-takers and chocolate makers have a different one, and somehow linking them all together so that everyone is working in each other's interests. If it's completely fragmented the market, with farmers selling to a middleman who then makes his cut and then sells to someone else eventually up the chain, it becomes very, very inefficient. So really for me, it's how you get that financing to the very beginning of the chain, the farmer. That's the real key. And that's how we can overcome many other issues in the cocoa sector, if we can get the financing to where it's needed.